the S&P 500 is down almost 20% from the beginning of the year. And this has only happened 8 times in the nearly 100 years of stock market history since 1928. The lowest bottom of this year so far sits at minus 25%, and this has only happened 5 times since 1928. Although this is not enough information to tell us where the market is most likely headed in 2023, this is enough to conclude one thing: we are going through extraordinary economic times. And to start analyzing the period of time we're going through, let's look at something called the gambler's fallacy. It is the mistaken belief that if you flip a coin 20 times in a row and you get tails 20 times in a row, then tails is less likely to come up on the next toss. But the truth is, the probability of flipping tails after having flipped 20 tails in a row is still 50%. It is very unlikely to get 20 tails in a row. In fact, the probability of that happening is 0.5, so 50% to the power of 20. So that's very, very unlikely. But we only know this before we toss the first coin. After that, it's 50-50 all the way. So this fallacy has obviously built the fortunes of many casinos and caused the dismay of many gamblers. But it also applies to the stock market, at least in purely mathematical terms, and that's why we're talking about it here. The probability of having a positive year or month or day after 5 negative ones is just the same as having a positive year after 1 negative year. But in the real world, things are not that simple. For starters, it's less risky to fall for the gambler's fallacy as a stock trader, because if you bet on a positive year, month, or day and you turn out to be wrong, you don't actually have to take the loss. You can hold on to your investment and wait until things turn around. Plus, you can put together adaptive strategies to react to market movements in the best way possible, even if you turned out to be wrong one time. But when you bet on black on roulette and you lose, your money's gone. Second, while it's unlikely but possible to get 15 blacks in a row when you play roulette, it's extremely unlikely that you would get 15 years in a row of negative years. I mean, that would be the end of the world, basically. In fact, there haven't been many consecutive negative years in the stock market history, period. During the nearly 100 years of stock market data we have, there's never been more than 5 consecutive negative years in a row. There's been 4 consecutive negative years in a row one time, from 1929 to 1932. There's been 3 consecutive negative years in a row 2 times, from 1939 to 1941 and from 2000 to 2002. And there's been 2 consecutive negative years one time, from 1973 to 1974. So even in the worst crisis of our modern economic times, which is the subprime crash of 2008-2009, that only had 1 negative year, 2008 at minus 38%. There have been 29 years with negative returns since 1928, and 20 of those have been followed by a positive one. That's 68% of the time. And we do know about the gambler's fallacy, right? We know that in absolute probabilistic terms, 2023 is as likely to be a negative year as it is to be a positive year. It's either green or red, up or down, heads or tails. It's 50-50, binary, unpredictable. But again, we're not looking at a coin toss here. We're looking at a very complex economic system built and tweaked by humans. And the key word here is humans, because if we look at what humans decided to do when they were presented with the same type of scenario a few years back, we can likely predict what they will do this time again, and so we can try to predict where the stock market will be headed. So the question then becomes, how predictable are humans? Unlike tossing a coin, the stock market is tied to the most human of all human traits: emotions and greed. This can make it easier to predict, because the statistical evidence from the past then becomes a lot more relevant to try to anticipate the future. Why? Because if a very large group of people reacts to one specific event in a certain way, it's very likely they will react the same way the next time it happens. This can be explained by comparing decisions and even predictions made by groups rather than individuals. Many studies have shown that 2 heads are better than 1 in most cases, and even for something seemingly impossible to just guess, human groups actually perform amazing. One of the most cited examples of a principle called the wisdom of crowds involves a group's collective ability to accurately guess the number of jelly beans in a jar. But for each individual, predicting the number of jelly beans is it's very, very hard, right? People do their best to estimate, but it's not surprising that most are way off. What is surprising though is that when you have a large enough group, the average answer tends to be highly accurate, even more accurate than the best guesser in the group. How crazy is that, right? Of course, guessing the number of jelly beans in a jar is not the same as guessing where the stock market is going, I get that. But in any set of circumstances, Some people will be reasonable, so some will say like, there's probably 200 beans in that jar. Some people will be greedy. Some people will be like, oh, there's definitely a million beans in that jar. Some people will act erratically. They're gonna try to break the jar to find out and count them one by one. Well, that's not allowed. Other people will think of different approaches to the problem. Maybe they're gonna try to first look through the glass to count them individually to get a better estimate. In other words, some people will be completely wrong in the way they approach the situation. Others will somehow get it right, and a few will handle it very well. And this gives us a good average. And so the general outcome will then be predictable by adding up all outcomes and looking at the average, but also by comparing the metrics to past occurrences. In the Jelly Bean study, the more studies with different groups, the broader the range of psychological profiles, and the more we'll be able to tell how likely the group is to be right and how close they will be based on the individuals that make up the group. On a day-to-day basis, human behavior is not predictable at all. We are animals at our core, and we don't respond to a fixed set of mathematical rules, at least not that we have figured out yet. But in the context of the stock market and the economy, human behavior actually tends to respond to a rather fixed set of rules. When prices get too high, interest rates get hiked. When interest rates rise, people borrow and spend less. When people spend less, there's less demand. When there's less demand, companies make less money. When companies make less money, their shares go down. And when companies' shares go down, the stock market loses value. When prices stabilize again, people start spending again. When people spend again, the economy picks up and the cycle starts over, right? People are also very predictable based on what information they get presented with. That's why online ads work so well. When people search for the term vintage t-shirt and they end up not buying one, it's very likely that they'll end up buying one if you keep presenting them with ads about vintage t-shirts for a week after that. When people read it's Black Friday everywhere, they will likely spend more money than usual because it's Black Friday. They want to save money, right? When people read that a crisis is coming, they start acting like a crisis is coming and they try to save more money. People's search history is also a great indicator of where their mind is at. And right now, people have never been more interested in the topic of inflation relative to any other year since 2004. We know this thanks to Google's publicly available search data. People are concerned about rising prices, and how much they're willing to spend on Black Friday and Christmas shopping will most likely dictate how 2022 will end, by picking up even more or by falling back down to lower territory again. This won't be the only factor, but it will be an important one. Conclusion. Here is an overview of the negative years in the stock market since 1928. We can see that more than 70% of those years didn't lose more than 10% in value. And here is how often the negative years were followed by a positive one. So for a drop of 5% or more, for instance, 64% of the years that lost 5% or more in value were followed by a positive year. That's how you read the table, and it's the same way for every row. So here we see again that based on past statistical evidence, it's more likely that 2023 will be a positive year. But based on how basic economic cycles work and how humans react to them, we may not have seen the bottom of this for sure yet. With the S&P 500 having already lost nearly 20% of its value and having bottomed at 25% earlier in the year, investing now is a good time regardless of next year, because even if the index loses another 25%, it will most likely pick up after that. Again, based on statistical evidence, we won't see more than 4 negative years in a row, and 2022 is almost out of the way already as a negative year. So it's only 3 more to go tops. The main factors in estimating this are, number 1, human behavior, because the market is tied to human emotions. So by looking at past patterns and how humans reacted to them, we can pretty accurately say what's going to happen. And number 2, anything more than 10 or even 5 negative years in a row, that would be like never seen before. So I mean, that would be like a massive recession or the end of the world. So you wouldn't even have to worry about investing in the stock market anymore, because you'll probably just have to worry about surviving. Thanks for watching. Remember to not invest more than you can afford to lose. See you next week. Enjoy the journey you're on.